We're doing our character sketch series, and we're on character sketch number 3. That's Sarah, and I call it Sarah, Mother of Nations, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Her name was Sarai in the beginning. Her family with Abram, that's what Abraham was called before his name was Abraham. Her family with Abram lived in Ur and then settled in the land of Haran. They were on their way to the land of Canaan, a land that God said he would show them. We're going to begin in Genesis 12, and I'm just going to walk you through some chapters that explain Sarai, who later becomes Sarah, her life, and what we can learn from her. God promised Abram that his descendants would get this land. We see that in verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. After a famine came to the land of Canaan, Abram sought refuge in Egypt. He lived there for a while due to the severity of the famine. Now, we don't see God condemning Abram for this behavior. Now, you can argue from absence there, or you can draw your own conclusions. But in other circumstances, we have God expressing his disfavor, or perhaps stopping somebody from doing something like this. And so he's in the land of Egypt, and he's there for a while due to the severity of the famine. And when we say he's there, we mean he and his family, his extended family. It includes his wife Sarai. It includes the servants. It includes Lot. And as he entered the land of Egypt, he had a very big ask of Sarai. It was an ask based in fear. Have you ever done that? Have you ever acted solely based on your fear? Because of what you were pretty sure was going to happen. What you were afraid would happen. And so he says to her, "You're beautiful." I'm sure she was like, "Oh, thank you." "They'll kill me to have you. Say you are my sister. If you do that, then they'll treat me well instead of kill me." He put Sarai in an awful spot. She was seeking to follow his lead as leader of not only their family, but at this point of their clan. And so she's seeking to follow his lead, but he's asking her to be deceptive. He's asking her to do something that's not true. And as this plan works its way out, things got carried away. You know, it's interesting with plans. We have plans, and then there's what happens. And what happens doesn't always follow the script of the plan. So things got carried away. Next thing you know, Sarai is in the king's palace. The king apparently is wooing her as to be one of his wives or one of his concubines. And Abram, he gets the royal treatment as her brother. He's basically seen as the male figure in her life who will grant permission or blessing of this union. Then the Lord strikes Pharaoh and his household as a result of this. Now, either the Lord revealed to Pharaoh the true nature of their relationship, or he figured it out. Sarai was Abram's wife. So Pharaoh sends them out of the country. We see that in chapter 12, verse 20. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. In chapter 13, we see that Abram, Sarai, and Lot moved back into the land. However, the land could not support all of their flocks, all of their herds, all of their tents. So Abram, being the man that he is, told Lot, "You have first choice. Look around you and decide what part of the land you want to reside in." And so Lot as the King James would say, pitched his tent towards Sodom. In other words, he decided to begin his journey toward Sodom. Now, we know from the scriptures what Sodom is like. Sodom is not a good city. The twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were morally corrupt. And Lot, given a choice, chose the moral corruption of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord promised Abram, though, look to the north, look to the south, the east, and the west. All the land you see, I will give you and your descendants forever. I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth, chapter 13, verse 16. With these promises, we see that no mention was made of Sarai. Now, you would think that would be a given, but the absence of her name in these promises would play into a decision later that would have importance even to this day. In Genesis 15, we read God's word to Abram, "Don't be afraid, I am your shield and your very great reward." Abram then reminds God that he had no children, and the heir of his estate was this foreigner, a servant of his. He's basically saying, God, you made these promises to me, but my heir is this foreigner who is my chief servant. If I were to die childless, everything would go to him. And again, while Sarai is an unmentioned presence, then God gave his covenant promise to Abraham to give him this land. God promised Abram a son. Count the stars, so your offspring will be. Chapter 15, verse 5. If you were to look at that verse, it says, "Then he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness." And so again, it is mentioned. Abram receiving the promises. No mention of Sarai, but they're a package deal in the eyes of God. In chapter 16, we see that they've been in Canaan for 10 years now. So time has gone by, and God's promises about a child, and the time is ticking. We're reminded that Sarai hasn't borne Abram any children as of yet. But she had this Egyptian servant, Hagar. And so Sarai encourages Abram to have children by her. She reasons, the reason we don't have any children, well, the promises were to Abram. So Abram's going to have the children, but there's no mention of who the female will be. So maybe it's not me. Maybe I need to take myself out of the equation and have children basically through surrogacy. My servant will bear the child, and I'll have children through her. And we see Abram foolishly giving into this plan. God's delay of 10 years led Sarai to seek to help God out. Now that sounds very foolish to us, but how often have we done something similar? How often have we sought to help God out? God keeps his promises, but God's timing is not like our timing. You see, we live in a culture where we just want everything now, immediately. We want speedy delivery. And apparently, Sarai was in that kind of mental state. She expected speedy delivery, and who could blame her after 10 years if it still hadn't happened, that she'd begin to doubt. But you know what? The thing she could have done with this was quite plain, because we see Abram building altars and having communications with God. And what Sarai could have said is, Abram, couldn't you just build an altar, pray to God, and ask him, is this child that you're supposed to have, is it really going to happen? Has God changed his mind? Is it supposed to be through me, or are we to look to another mother of this child who will be a surrogate for me? And if she had done that, imagine how things would be different. But after this plan of having this child through Hagar, after it resulted in a pregnancy, tension built up. And it spilled over into the relationship between Hagar and Sarai. And Sarai mistreated her, the Bible tells us, and Hagar fled. And where did Hagar flee? She fled out into the desert. Now, does that sound reasonable to you? Does that sound like Hagar had a plan? It seemed like the only plan that Hagar had was to get away from this woman. She fled out into the desert, but thanks be to God, the Lord met her near a spring in the desert, we're told. Now think about that. You think, how did she find that spring? By luck? By chance? Because she knew it was there? I guess those things are possible, but perhaps the real reason is because God directed her, even in her panic. God was with her, even in her fear, even in her emotional reaction. And you know, in the worst of our times, God can be there for us. And when we think of mothers, you know, because the season that we're in now we're in the season of Mother's Day. And here is a woman who was a mother. In fact, later on is called the mother of all nations. And here she's just seeking to be that mother. And she's wondering, well, how do I go about that? You know, is it through Hagar? And she thinks that must be the case because all these years have gone by. And so she comes up with this plan, and Abram follows through on it, and now we got a big mess. Apparently this wasn't to be. And so the Lord meets Hagar near a spring in the desert. And Hagar admitted that she was running from her master, Sarai. In chapter 16, verse 8, it reads, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. You know, that must have been a hard message to hear. You know, mothers all the time have to do the hard things. They have to do the hard things that are right for their child. Hagar had an unborn child within her. The right thing to do was to give up this runaway plan. She was running in the desert. How foolish. There was plenty of provision back where she came from with Abram and Sarai. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and sure, her treatment wasn't ideal. But for her unborn child, she decided to go back and submit herself to Sarai. Now God promised her a blessing of many descendants through her unborn child. And why would God promise such a thing? Because this child also was a child of Abraham. God named her child Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. We find out in verse 16, and still Sarai did not have a child. Now 13 years later, we find out in chapter 17, when Abram was 99, God reaffirmed his covenant. You'll be the father of many nations. Your name will change from Abram to Abraham, father of many, it means. Nations and kings will come from you. Can you imagine? That would just blow you away to receive such promises from God. The land of Canaan will be yours and your descendants after you as an everlasting possession, verse 8. And Sarai will now be called Sarah. That means princess. I will bless her and give you a son by her. Finally, it is crystal clear. She will be the mother of nations. Kings will come from her. Sarai, you just need to be patient. Sarai, you need to wait. Abraham laughed. Will a son be born to a 100-year-old? And Sarah bear a child at 90? Now, God does not confront Abraham about his laughter. It doesn't seem like he confronts in this passage about it. So maybe it was an expression like this. Shall I, a 100-year-old, have a son? And Sarah bear a child at 90? Ha! What incredible news! You know, we laugh with joy at things. And God said, yes, Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And that name means laughter. So God has named both these children, Ishmael and Isaac. I'll establish my everlasting covenant with him and his descendants after him. Verse 19, that's very important, because here God is distinguishing between Abraham's offspring. Ishmael, he will be blessed. And he'll be somebody who will receive the blessing of being a child of Abraham, but not the one that the covenant promises flow through. That will be Isaac's alone. I'll establish my everlasting covenant with him and his descendants after him. And then he told the child will arrive by this time next year. Now, keep in mind, now only Abraham has heard these words. Sarah hasn't heard these words yet. And yet, finally, God is explicit, because they're a little hard of understanding here. So God is explicit with them. The implication was there that Sarah would be a part of this package. But since you don't seem to understand that, let me make it crystal clear. Sarah's a part of this process. Sarah will be a mother. And Sarah will enjoy these promises being fulfilled in her and in her descendants after her, just like you, Abraham. In Genesis 18, Abraham receives visitors. There's 3 of them. They're 3 men by appearance. The passage reveals it was the Lord and 2 angels in disguise. Abraham and Sarah host them and feed them. And one of them promised Abraham that he would return this time next year, and he would have a son with Sarah. Sarah overheard it in the tent and began to laugh. The Lord, in appearance as a man, asked, "Why were you laughing, Sarah?" To which she denied laughing. He then asked, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" Think about all the mothers who had trouble having children. Sarah could identify with you. And yet, here we have the promise of God. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? You think about the hardest things that you go through, the biggest trials you go through, the setbacks, the health crises you go through, the financial crisis you go through. Isn't it great to hear, is anything too difficult for the Lord? The Lord can see us through those as well. Then the Lord revealed to Abraham what he was about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. Due to Lot and his family's presence there, Abraham pleaded for mercy. And God promised, if 10 righteous were found there, so you think about that, that's Lot, his daughters, sons-in-law. If there's 10 righteous there, so they only had a handful that they had to influence for God. If 10 righteous were found there, he would spare the city. Well, smoke arose over the twin cities, and so Abraham knew that 10 righteous were not found there. But the Bible reveals that God rescued Lot and his family using those same 2 angels. Again, in chapter 20, Abraham unfortunately uses the "she's my sister" routine. While in Gerar, he uses it again. Even though it was a disaster in Egypt, he tries it out again. And again, it goes badly. What a surprise. Before we judge too harshly, how many times have we gone back and repeated the same sins, repeated the same mistakes, done the same stupid stuff? whether mothers, fathers, children, whoever we may be. And then in chapter 21, Isaac's born. Ishmael would be about 14. And in verse 6, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about it will laugh with me. So she's talking about laughter of joy. Then Ishmael and Hagar are sent away. Abraham wasn't for it at first, but then God says, I'm in it. Don't worry about it. I will take care of them. Through Isaac your seed will be called, not through Ishmael. And then we come to Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, we see that God tests Abraham sometime later, commanding that he offer his only son Isaac, the only son of promise, on Mount Moriah. Now you think about this. This is the one through whom the promises would go. Now if he's dead, how can the promises go through him? The Bible reveals later on that what Abraham thought God would do is basically raise him from the dead so that he could keep his promises. So he wasn't worried. He had faith that God would keep his promises, even as God told him, I want you to kill your son as an offering to me. And so we see Abraham arising early. He takes his son to the mountain, and on the way Isaac asks, here's the wood, here's the fire, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham responded, God will provide the lamb. God will provide the lamb. How prophetic that was. And it was foreshadowing how the Lamb of God would be the substitute for us who deserve death for our sin. And so there would be a sacrifice that would be a substitute for Isaac. And this is how it played out. Abraham raised his knife over his son to kill him, and a voice from heaven told him to refrain. And his attention was drawn to a ram caught in a thicket. It would be the substitute for Isaac. In Genesis 22, verse 13, that Abraham called the place Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. Oh, my friends, the Lord will provide. Sometimes it seems that God doesn't provide in the timing that we want him to provide. It seems that God sometimes has a different schedule in mind than we do. We would like it to be early and often, and more than enough from the beginning. And often enough, God has a different plan. But remember, the Lord does provide. Think about other times in your life where the Lord provided for you. God then reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham. I will bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens and the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring, the nations of the earth will be blessed. And then chapter 23, Sarah lived to be 127 years of age, and she died. Remember, we're closer to creation at that point, less pollution, less problems with diseases and the things that kill us, the cancers and such. These things have not built up over much time to make our lives much shorter. And so she dies at 127, and Abraham mourned for Sarah, and he bought a land for her burial plot from the Hittites. Sarah blamed herself. She blamed herself, not her husband, for not having a child. How many of us are guilty of the same? Maybe as mothers, maybe as fathers, maybe as individuals in other people's lives, we blame ourselves for things that are not our fault. Sarah would understand that. We see also that she grew impatient with God's plan, with God's timing, instead of waiting on him. How guilty we are often of that, whether we be mothers or parents or children or just, everyday servants of God seeking to live for him. We grow impatient with God instead of waiting on him. The other thing we see Sarah do is when God revealed it would be through her. When God revealed, yes, this child to come will be through you, she laughed. She laughed. Why? Because she looked at the limits of her condition. She looked at the limitations of her old body instead of looking at the unlimited nature of the power and the purposes of God. Let me say that again. She looked at the limitations of her body rather than the unlimited nature of the power and the purposes of God. How many times do we do that? We look at ourselves and we look at this problem that's so much bigger than us. We lose our focus off of Jesus, off of God being Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides, the Almighty, the one who has made everything that is, who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. We lose sight of all of that, and all we think of is our limitations and our smallness in the face of this great big problem that's in front of us, instead of looking at the unlimited nature of the resources and the kindnesses of God. On the positive side, she had that baby. She raised that boy, and we're not given a lot of details of what that looked like. But she went through all of that, raising that boy for the future that he would have. We can be grateful for our mothers doing the same. She also rejoiced, and she engaged in happy laughter over that son that God gave her. She laughed again, but this time for joy. And she died knowing that God keeps his promises, that he can indeed be trusted. I pray that that is how you die. Not walking away from God. Not believing that, oh, there's no God anymore. You don't believe that anymore. You walk away from God. You walk away from church. You walk away from all these things. And you just live this bitter life. Instead, that you would die knowing that God keeps his promises and that he can be trusted. Life is hard, but God is good. That's what we see from the life of Sarah.